Thank you, and thank you all for coming after lunch to this session. This session will be about how recommendation engines monetize their business and how models must adapt to those business models, how basically machine learned models must adapt to the business models to make things really work. And the journey begins basically in around 1992 when the Tapestry system comes out of Research Park, of Xerox PARC in Palo Alto. And it's the first recommendation system in the sense that we know it today. It was about recommendations of mailing groups and mailing lists, basically in the very early days of the internet. But then the real boom came with Amazon in basically 20 years ago when their recommendation system that was basically based on this idea of people who bought or looked at items like you also bought. This very simple idea turned Amazon from a large bookstore, but basically a bookstore, into an e-commerce giant that can sell you everything and anything. And now these same ideas are applied everywhere. E-commerce, of course, multimedia streaming sites, whether it's YouTube or Netflix or Rhapsody, content sites, that's Outbrain's business, even social networks which recommend now friends to you. And also, there's an academic conference, a dedicated ACM conference for recommendation systems. It started basically 10 years ago in 2007. And a lot of the momentum in this area is because of the Netflix prize. Now, most of you probably heard about the Netflix prize. It was basically one of the first examples of crowdsourcing, but of researcher crowdsourcing. Netflix basically said, look, here's some data, and help us improve our own recommendation algorithm by 10%, and whoever manages to get through that gets $1 million. And here's some data that they gave. They gave 100 million ratings of type user saw a movie and rated it 1 through 5. It spanned about 500,000 users and almost 20,000 movies. Spanned over 6 years of Netflix data, and it took 3 years for the crowd of researchers to basically win or achieve this 10% improvement over the legacy system that Netflix had. Now, what they asked for is a reduction in terms of root mean squared error. And basically then, people started thinking, is this the right error function? So just to recap, what was the problem? If you take all the users and items in Netflix test data, and your system predicts that those are the cues, predicts how this user would rate this item on a scale of 1 to 5, and then you subtract the real rating, and you square that, and you average, that's the root mean squared error. Now, it looks like it makes sense. You know, it's a nice function, and it's easy to manipulate in learning models, but there was criticism here. And the criticism was that in this error function, distinguishing really awful recommendations from simple bad ones is just as important as distinguishing the great from the good. And why would your models waste energy, so to speak, on trying to distinguish the lower end of the recommendation space when actually you only want to recommend to a person items that they are likely to enjoy? Now, along with root mean squared error, there is another metric that is often used for ranking purposes, for training rankers, and that is area under curve. Basically here, you know, it's written in a bit more complex manner, but the basic premise is basically the same. Look at how you rank a pair of items in your models versus how the real data is, and just compute the probability that a random pair of items, your predictions would agree with whatever the system actually has. So basically, if the sign of the user preference of I over J, or like, is I better than J in both the predicted ratings and the actual ratings, or is I worse than J in both, then the sign here would be +1, and otherwise it would be negative, and it wouldn't, the indicator wouldn't count. That's basically it, but it suffers from the exact same problem that if you train a ranker for area under curve, again, it is just as important to distinguish the crap, for lack of a better word, from the just plain worse or bad than it is to distinguish the great from the very good. Now, if you look at what the business model of Netflix is and Napster, Rhapsody, all those guys, their business models are basically charge users with a flat monthly fee and let them consume whatever they want, however items they want, whichever items they want. In particular, it doesn't seem to be the case that these services gain more from serving item A over item B. Now, I'm not an expert on the actual monetization schemes of Netflix, and maybe there are royalties that deem this movie more expensive to them than that movie, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So it does seem to be that they don't gain more from this movie than they do from that movie, and they charge a monthly fee. So basically, to gain user loyalty, what they are basically doing is serving a top K recommendation problem that is fully incentive compatible with the users. So however they make the users more happy, that's the better outcome for them, because more users will make subscriptions and keep with the service and so on. And in a top K problem, what's important is really to distinguish the great from the very good from the good, and what's not important is to distinguish the mediocre from the bad from the awful. So if we abandon root mean squared error and area under curve, we can look at error functions that are more tuned for top K ranking measures. For example, mean reciprocal rank. Basically, you look at the inverse rank of the first relevant recommendation for a user, and it has easy extensions for multiple relevant recommendations for a user. You have functions like mean average precision or normalized discounted cumulative gain. All these basically emphasize whatever happens in the top of the recommended list way more than they do at the bottom of the recommended list. And so they really emphasize for top K problems. So that seems good. But then, and here's an example of a challenge that we gave with our data to the research community that used actually mean average precision. So I'm putting this here to just show how sizes have grown since 2007 or 6 Netflix to 2016. When we launched this competition, we gave out 2 billion page views, over 700 million unique user IDs, and the test set was 6 million clicks. And again, it was for MAP or MRR. Those were equivalent in this test case. But basically, so you can go with top K error functions. However, a lot of times recommendation systems actually do monetize differently different items. So whether it's the case or not in Netflix, probably not. In the market, basically what you have is a fruit salad of items where some fruit are just more expensive or are more worthy to you than others as a recommender. And basically the most known model for this is the yield ranking model, where the score of a recommendation is really the product of the probability that it will be consumed by the user, so basically a relevance, the relevance of the recommendation for the user, times what it will yield for the recommender to have the user consume this recommendation. And in the ad space on the web, the very common model is one of cost-per-click models. We can see some of these in the works. So on Google, basically the ad over there, Google gets paid if users click on those ads. In Yahoo Gemini, again, this item here about men and their skin will basically, the advertiser will pay some money to Yahoo if it is clicked. And also the Outbrain model, where our recommendations in the top line, the promoted stories, we will get paid if people consume those recommendations or get clicked. So again, a recommendation engine in this setting needs to take into account the probability that a recommendation will be consumed times how much income will be derived once that consumption event happens. Now, as a side, I want to explain that even in recommendations that circulate traffic within the same site and on which there is no payment, money doesn't change hands, there still is a principle of recommending for yield or optimizing for yield, because although between the recommendation engine and CNN in this case, no money is exchanged when users click the internal more from CNN recommendations, CNN does gain something. What does CNN gain? Basically, every page view that happens on CNN loads up a page with ads on it. And those ads generate revenue for CNN. And once you can actually measure and correctly attribute revenue to each and every page view, you can then also optimize the clicks that keep the user within the same site for how much money the publisher will make out of those recommendations. And again, it's the probability of users consuming those recommendations times how much will the publisher gain from all the ads that happen on the landing page. Okay, so if we take a look at cost per click settings, as I said, you typically need to estimate the CTR, so that's the predicted CTR up on the slide. Multiply that by the cost per click, how much money will change hands if users do click that recommendation, and that basically gives you some expected cost per impression. Now, CTR prediction is an instance of response prediction, lots of response prediction problems on the web, and those are typically learned from log level data. So both impression features and user features that resulted in a click or in no click. The error functions are typically of the type of minimizing log loss or squared error or regret. Now, oftentimes with these cases, there are many more negative examples than there are positive examples. So the non-click event is much more prevalent than the click event. So you often need to subsample the negatives, and you may need to take into account viewability, meaning not every recommendation you put on the page was actually viewed by the user. Maybe they didn't scroll that far and so forth. So it's a complicated setting. And let's see what's important here. Now, because the engagement of the user is not the only factor in the ranking, there's also this cost per click component that comes in. Now you really need to predict accurately user engagement or user relevance of the item or click-through rates, even at low click-through rates levels, right? Because a low click-through rate item, if its cost per click is very high, could still rank up and make your top K recommendation list. So yeah, you do need to predict accurately over the entire range of the recommendations, but what's not important here? What's not important here is if by some mechanism your models learn with a constant multiplicative factor that skews the predictions. So for example, take a modeling of the world that says that the probability of a click of a user on an item is the product of the absolute relevance of that item to the user times the user's propensity to click on recommendations or ads or any other item on the page. So you can take two different users. The item is actually relevant the same for both, but one of them is a clicker and one of them is not a clicker. If you ignore propensity to click, nothing actually happens to your model. It still serves fine recommendations to users. Not only does it serve the same recommendations, because the propensity to click will just cancel out on each item's score, what also happens is if you then price items with the generalized second price auction mechanism, again, inspired by Google, then even the pricing is oblivious to this propensity to click, okay? Because the pricing of each item, or the pricing of item number K, is basically the cost per click of item K plus 1 times the ratio of predicted CTRs of item K and item K plus 1, and the propensity to click would simply cancel out. So yes, you do need to be accurate over the entire scale of click-through rates, but you don't need to worry about constant multiplicative errors. So that seems good. But then things get more complicated. And they get more complicated because a lot of ad tech settings actually support mixed monetization models, not only CPC, which we talked about, CostPerClick, but also CPM and CPA. So what are those acronyms? CPM, or cost per mille, French for 1,000 impressions, basically is a model whereby simply serving an ad on a web page, the publisher or whoever owns that web property already gets paid, regardless of whether the user looks at it, clicks it, interacts with it in any other way. CPA, or cost per acquisition, is the other extreme. You put an ad on the page, but the advertiser would only pay if not only a click would happen, but also some downstream event would happen. For example, the user would either purchase something, I mean, purchasing is great, or open an account on your system, or subscribe to a newsletter, or download a catalog. Any indication of the user progressing towards a potential transaction later on. Now, once you have CPA, CPM, and CPC competing for space on the page, you need to somehow normalize them to a common language to be able to compare apples to apples rather than apples and oranges. And the comparison is typically by expected CPM. And if you think about it, our grade, the recommendation grade from earlier, the predicted CTR times CPC, which was the expected revenue from an impression, from single impression, if you multiply that by 1,000, it's effectively expected CPM, or expected cost per mille. And now you can start comparing recommendations or items that compete with different monetization models. And you can do the same for CPA recommendations. You need to first estimate the probability of a click, and then you need to estimate the probability of some conversion or some transaction happening after the click. And then you multiply that by the CPA, the cost you will receive if the user indeed follows up on the ad, clicks, and then converts, times 1,000. Now, each of these problems is of the similar nature, except that to compute the probability of conversion given a click, that's a much sparser problem. So there's this huge funnel first between impressions and clicks. Again, most ad events do not result in a click. And then there's a huge drop-off between people who have clicked on something and people who actually performed a transaction on the resulting page. So sparsity is a problem for the last bullet, but if you have enough data, you can work through that. However, now, when we are comparing eCPMs, now you really need to eliminate any and all biases from your computation. You can no longer ignore factors like a user's propensity to click, because if you ignore that, you will not be able to compare the CPC item correctly to the CPM item. So really what you need now for this type of recommendation setting is absolute accurate response prediction, where of course it has to be unbiased. It also should be low variance, and it should be unbiased and low variance on the entire range of the responses. Starting from very likely responses, items that really resonate with the user, and going all the way down through correctly predicting the response on items that shouldn't resonate that much with the user, but there still is some low probability of a user consuming them for some reason or another. It needs to be both contextual and personalized, need to take into account everything you know about the user, everything you know about the context. It needs to adapt quickly to temporal changes. So here an online learning component needs to happen, because these response predictions, they don't stay static for a very long time. The web is very dynamic, and maybe when you're talking about movies, like in the Netflix case, most movies are not new releases, and so maybe their hype is stable over a long time. Maybe just the new releases of this week or last week are temporally sensitive items. But certainly when you talk about content with news cycles being 24 hours, 12 hours, sometimes 3 to 4 hours in breaking news, the temporal sensitivity of items and responses for those items is definitely high. As I said earlier, you need to cope with data sparsity. Transactions that then pay you CPAs are very low, cold start problems, etc. Okay, and the last point with a couple of slides is that you also need to adapt to marketplace conditions, which dictate that sometimes your income as a recommendation engine depends not by what you recommend, but by where you recommend. And let's take an example from a totally different domain. Let's say you're a seller, and you're selling some inventory, and you can sell it through Amazon, through Sears, through eBay, through Buy.com. You have multiple channels of selling your merchandise. It's not necessarily the case that you keep the same cut out of your product regardless of the channel. It could be that you need to pay Amazon a larger fee on your item than you do eBay or Sears. So basically, your share could vary depending on the channel through which you're selling. And in Outbrain's case, we share our revenues with publishers, and it's not only always the same percent. So some publishers we will pay or share more revenue with than others. So channels do matter. Now, if you have unlimited inventory, if you have something that you can manufacture as many items as you want, then just sell it through whatever channels you have. But in many cases, your inventory is limited. You have 1,000 of these TVs to sell. You have a budget for 10,000 clicks on this specific content item. Now, when your inventory is limited, you may need to optimize the inventory to channel assignment problem, because selling an item here will prevent you from selling it there. You have limited supply. So you really need to consider where do you want to spend or sell each item. And in ad tech, again, it is very well known that because campaigns or advertising campaigns have budgets, there's just a limited amount of clicks that can go in each area, and maybe it's better to serve your campaign here and that campaign there. Now, this is no longer a machine learning problem. It's no longer a classic recommendation problem. It's really an operations research problem. But again, if you want to monetize recommendations, you need to also be able to do some operations research. That's it. Thank you very much, and happy to take questions if we have time.